Welcome to Honeybee Watch Symposia series. This is the first public online event that we've done, and I can tell already that it's going to be a great success because 135 of you have signed up, and we have already 70 people who have signed in. I'm Steve Rogenstein. I'm your host, the behind-the-scenes producer, and also the project director of Honeybee Watch. And I'm joined here today by Rodrigo Moro, who is our science director. And today we're going to introduce you to Honeybee Watch, give a brief introduction, and then we're going to hear from 4 honeybee research pioneers. So today we're going to tackle protocols, specifically monitoring. And it's especially important when you're dealing with free-living nests. So imagine that you know where bees are living in a tree or in the side of your building or in a chimney. You have registered for Honeybee Watch, you've entered them in the site, you've uploaded photos, you've answered our preliminary questions, we validated it, published it, and then what? Up until now, not much has happened. However, we hope that that's going to change very soon. As we'll hear from our guests, this next stage after locating hives and colonies is to monitor them, to physically visit them and record certain data points. There are basic questions such as, is the nest still, is it active? Do you see pollen going in? Can you visit it at least 3 times a year? And beyond that, there are countless other data points, all of which are worthy of attention and some of which we'll discuss today. But when you're managing a citizen science research project, you have to balance between what you desire as a researcher and what's realistic to actually get and demand of or request of the people who are participating. So there's that fine balance, and it can be tricky. So I could go on and on and on, but we're really here to hear from our guests. So we have guests from Serbia, Ireland, the UK, and the US. Each of them will get 10 minutes, which is not a lot of time, to talk about their projects and to talk about monitoring. And now I'm going to introduce our guests. And then to move right along, we are going to our last speaker, but obviously not our least, Thomas Seeley, who basically needs no introduction. His decades-long study of free-living bees in the Arnot Forest in upstate New York has served as a model for researchers around the world. And in fact, his contribution of a basic monitoring tool for users of log hives from the Learning from the Bees conference in Berlin in 2019 directly led to the founding of Honeybee Watch. So to him, I'm personally grateful for your inspiration and motivation, and it's a pleasure to welcome you here today for our first symposium. So hey, Tom, you've got 10 minutes.
Great, let's see if I can bring this up. Share, new share. Go. Share that. And then full screen.
That's working.
Very good. Great. I've just finished the hardest part. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to join this program. And I'm going to focus on the topic, monitoring sites occupied by wild colonies of honeybees. As you can see, an example of one. Now, I'll say a little bit of the historical context of how I got interested in this work, which began 50 years ago. In the 1970s, I began studying the lives of these wild colonies rather than colonies in apiaries. And I didn't know of anybody that knew anything about the wild colonies in the United States and North America. And I have to say, looking back, I think I was inspired in part by Jane Goodall's studies of wild chimpanzees, because she was in a position where people had studied chimps in zoos, but not in the wild. I felt a parallel situation. My first publication on this topic was sort of basic natural history, a description of their natural nests. You can see that was back in '76. And so the data were collected in the early '70s. My study location is in the United States, in North America, in the state of New York, which is up in the Northeast. This is an area, part of the world where the native vegetation is deciduous forest, as we will see. And I monitor, let's see, I'm going to clean up this a little bit. There we go. to monitor the free-living colonies, which are in trees in the forest. It is, as we just heard from Filipe, they tend to be high up. So I use my key tool here is binoculars. Some of the colonies that I monitor, though, it's still free living, are in buildings, such as this dairy barns. And those are nice. And that's how I find a lot of the wild colonies, is I've put adverts when we had newspapers in newspapers and got it that way. So partly by beelining in forests and then adverts for buildings. And why do I monitor these sites? Well, several things. Living colonies, nobody knew anything about that back in the 70s. I also wanted to learn about the features of the home sites of these free living colonies. Again, nothing was known. And I wanted to learn how long these home sites are continuously occupied. Many of the beekeepers at the time said, oh no, they don't live very long. They get disease or something, or they starve. But nobody knew. And I wanted, when Varroa came in the early 2000s, like or late 1990s, I monitored these colonies because I wanted to see what was going to happen at the population level, how Varroa affected the genetics of the free living colonies. And I suspected it would be a selective agent. It wasn't going to kill the population, but it would probably be a selective agent for resistance to Varroa. How do I monitor the sites? Well, it's not rocket science. It's pretty simple. I choose a warm, sunny day, as Filipe has mentioned, and others, when the bees are flying. I bring my binoculars. I carry a bound notebook, and I do as others have mentioned, I look for bees bringing in pollen. If they are present, then I know that that site houses a live colony. If they're absent or no bees are flying, of course, then the site is without a live colony. And so I really just discriminate whether a site is alive or dead. Okay, I'll come back to that. Now, so that last slide was how. We've gone why, how, when. Oops. When do I monitor the sites? This is similar. My protocol is similar to what others have mentioned. I just do 3 inspections a year. In the spring, and I time the spring inspection in early May before the swarm season starts. And this enables me to assess the winter survival of the colonies that are on my checklist. Then in the summer, second check after the swarm season, late July for us. This gives me information about reoccupations of dead out sites. And then in autumn, before winter, this would be late September, I assess the summer survival by checking the colonies. And it again lets me detect reoccupations of dead out sites. Let me give you an example of what this, it's just 3 times a year, but it adds up over time in terms of good information. For example, here's an oak tree. And the color code is, if it's green, it was May, July, and September, it was alive there. Now I knew that colony was an established colony from somebody that reported it to me. That's how I found the site. And that colony lived along through the first 2 years I watched it, and then it was dead in the spring of 2012. And eventually I dropped that site. Here's a more complicated story. Here's one where the Caroline cabin, there's a log cabin up in the hills. And it was again, the owner of the cabin told me that bees had been there. So I knew it was an established colony. And that it continued on through 2011. Then in this, again, spring of 2012, it was dead. Then it was reoccupied. And then that becomes what I call a founder colony. And that founder colony survived till the next spring, but then died out in the summer. So it's a color coding, but this is the system I use. It gives me a pretty good sense of what's going on. And here are the probabilities of wild colony survival that I have found over the time I've been doing that. In the summer, the colonies that are established, I need colonies that have gotten through their previous winter, they almost always persist, survive in the summer. The founder colonies, the new colonies established by swarms, they also have a very high survival in the summer. Now, what about over winter? Well, this is a rough part of the world. We get a couple of meters of snow each winter, often goes well below 0 degrees centigrade. I burn about 5 cord of wood to keep my house warm. And so in the winter, the established colonies do okay. About 82% of them get from the fall to the next spring. They're alive next spring. The ones that really have a tough time are the founder colonies, because many of them have to move into a new site, build combs, amass food. And if they get out, if they can get established, founding the colony in early summer, they do better. But if it's after June, it's very hard. So the winter colony survival of its first winter is poor. However, if you go through the numbers on these things, it actually underlies why the population is as stable as I find it. And I'll talk about that shortly. You just go through those numbers, and the 18% of the established colonies that die over winter are replaced basically by this product times the product above to get the numbers back to 1. And so it was a neat finding that it really is stable. Now, what I want to talk about now is one of the special areas that I study. It's a forest that's owned by Cornell University, and it's surrounded by more forest lands. Cornell University is in a city called Ithaca. North of it is excellent farmland. It was settled, very wonderful flat farmland. But below it, we were starting to get into the Appalachian Highlands, the mountains. And so it's hilly. There were farms up here, but they've been abandoned. It's grown back to forest. And that's how Cornell owns this forest. And in the forest, I can go beelining, and I track down wild colonies. And this is a rough outline of the Arnot Forest. You can see surrounding it is more forest land. The only real activity out here is timber harvesting, and this is a sawmill over here. And I can't claim to have a comprehensive map at any one time of all the wild colonies in the forest. But one summer when I mapped out the northern portion of the forest, these are the distributions where I found the colonies. And it works out. I've done this, let's see, can't recall quite how many times offhand, but it works out consistently, 1 wild colony per square kilometer. Now that's pitiful compared to what Filipe just reported, but it's because the forage is very, very sparse. Not much forage in a heavily forested area.
Tom, you have about a minute left.
Okay, here we are in October. We did a genetic analysis, which I'll just finish up with, where we compared, and here's of interest to many of you, I think. We'd have two samples of colonies in the 1970s without Varroa, pre-Varroa, 2010s with Varroa. And you can see they genetically, I won't go through how this is genetic differences are represented here, but they're distinct. So these colonies, there was a very strong selection in the early 2010s. And that's reflected also in the mitochondrial DNA. The population of bees in the Arnot Forest, it used to have 12 mitotypes or queen lines basically in it. It's down to 2. And here again, these are the probabilities. But the colonies survive as well now in the 2010s as they did in the 1970s pre-Varroa. So the colonies, and this is a very positive message. It means even when you have Varroa, even when Varroa comes in as a novel parasite, the bees have adapted to it. Strong sign of bees adaptation. And I'll just end with this. Always, I think, lovely sign of life in a wild colony's home, a bee zooming in with loads of pollen. That much.
That's a great picture. Thank you, Tom. I know that 50 years in 10 minutes is a near impossible task, but you seem to have done it. And when we sent out the confirmation emails with the Zoom link, everybody should have received the monitoring protocols. And Tom included an article that he'd written in Apidology about these free-living colonies and the results of your monitoring, if I'm not mistaken, correct?
Correct.
Right. So thank you to all of our speakers. That concludes the first section of the symposium. What I love is that you each represent different aspects of this huge spectrum of free living bees. You have bees that are in the city, you have bees that are all over a country, specifically in a forest, studying them for 50 years, studying them for 2 years. And what we wanted for this particular symposium was to have different perspectives, different experiences to come together and have a conversation.